You didn't vanish yet.
Okay, I'm
Can you
working
hear
on it.
me? I guess you can hear me, and just let me know if there's an issue. Wonderful to see everyone, and I'm really grateful for this invitation from the Scoville Library. I've been watching some of the programs that you've been having, and I particularly enjoyed the Ben Killam presentation on bears about a month ago. So outstanding lineup of presentations and a consortium of groups that have been bringing these wonderful opportunities to people through these webinars. So what I'm going to do is share my screen and share my talk with you. And I want to let you know that I'm going to try and monitor the chat during my talk. So if you have a quick question or something like that, you can feel free to try and type it in. If I notice it, I'll try and answer it if possible. If not, I'll pick it up at the end. But that can often, quickly get little thoughts integrated in. So I'm going to try and share my screen here. And oops. Oh, great. Okay, wonderful. So the title of my talk today is Forests and Brain Health, Back to the Future. And so as Claudia mentioned, I'm officially a professor of applied science at Trinity College. I was a Charles Bullard Fellow at Harvard in a joint appointment between Harvard Forest and Harvard Medical School. That was during a sabbatical I had from Trinity. I'm involved in a number of different community organizations, and I'm on the Open Space Commission in my town. I was also the co-chair of the Science and Technology Working Group of the Governor's Council on Climate Change. So I wear a number of different hats. I have a very deep appreciation for evolution and for complex systems like brains and like forest ecosystems. And I think for both of these topics, we're starting to understand that some observations that scientists had 100 or 200 years ago are now things that we're understanding more with modern techniques and strategies, and understanding that these are things that are really critical for us to wrap our arms and our minds around for our future on the planet. So my take-home message, I always like to start with that, is that we really need nature, and it's fundamentally important. And I feel like the two most important things that we need are healthy brains and a healthy ecology. These are our lifelines to the future. They're our lifelines to take care of each other and to have healthy communities. So from my perspective, these need to be absolute priorities in all of our other planning decisions that we make as we try and make choices among what we're doing where and how we're spending our money. And what I'm going to do today is go through a kind of a little arc from history to science and to kind of thinking about the future. And I really like to keep in the front of my mind something that Gina McCarthy said at a Connecticut forum about a year and a half ago. And she said, "What kind of a future do you want?" And this is where we really need our big brains on it. We need interdisciplinary approaches. And we all need to be thinking about what kind of a future do we want and how are we going to get there? I'm going to start actually with one neuron. And this neuron was drawn by Santiago Ramon y Cajal. He was born, he had his 150th birthday in 2002. So he's kind of one of the big grandfathers of neuroscience, and he used this technique that other scientists had used, but he was suddenly able to understand fundamental properties of the brain by using this technique, drawing neurons in the brain, looking at all the different types of neurons, looking at where they were projecting to and from. And he put forth the neuron doctrine, which basically said that a neuron is the fundamental unit of the nervous system. Previously, scientists thought it was all just kind of a mush of stuff, because when you look at a brain, you open up someone's head, it all looks the same. It's about the consistency of soft tofu. It can't even hold up under its own weight, and it just looks like a big mush. And he did this very, very detailed work showing that neurons are the fundamental unit. He developed theories about cellular connectionism, all the circuits that are going and matching in the brain. He developed theories about plasticity of brain function, which we didn't have any scientific evidence about until, 100 years later, more than 100 years later. So many fundamental things he was able to talk about based on really detailed scientific work and discovery. So just looking at this one neuron, which is called a pyramidal neuron, which is in our cortex, which is our most highly evolved large area that's covering our brain. It's very large in us and primates, cetaceans like dolphins and whales, elephants. And basically this one pyramidal neuron, you can see it has all of these connections going in all directions. And another thing that I'd like to show you about this neuron, and there's just, millions and millions of neurons in your brain, but what he noticed, and if you look at point C here and point A, I'm going to show you a little close-up of those. If you look at point C, you can see all these little fuzzy things on the edge of the process from the neuron. We now know that this process, we call it a dendrite, and these little fuzzy things are all dendritic spines. They're all spots where another neuron is talking to this neuron. So you can see, but going back to the main neuron here, how many connections this neuron is receiving from other neurons, just thousands of them. So it's receiving all from within this a lot within this horizontal layer. It's receiving from this big process that goes straight up to the surface of the brain. And it's also receiving some down below. So it's a very complex structure with so many connections that it's receiving. And the other thing he noticed is that every neuron had one process called the axon, which doesn't have those spiny things. And so you can see right here at point A, that's where he's labeled A for the axon. And this kind of power of observation, fundamental observations that historical scientists had, we've now verified with so many new techniques and tools. But I have a very deep appreciation for these fundamental observations that were done from just very, very detailed work. And I also have a deep appreciation for how much we still don't know. For example, the stain that he used to develop all of these fundamental observations, we don't know how that stain works. We still use it all the time now in neuroscience. I just did it a few weeks ago with my students. We don't know how that technique even works, but it has revealed fundamental observations in the nervous system. So related to the environment, there have also been a number of historical practices and observations that I think are now coming to the fore as lining up with science. And this is just a very, very brief overview. Of course, indigenous cultures have always had a very strong relationship to the land, and their spiritual practices are connected to our primary reality, which is the natural world that sustains us. Charles Darwin didn't have any kind of special techniques. He just had his 200th birthday, I think in 2006 or 2008. My notes are all scribbled, but it was very recent. So a lot of these scientists were kind of the same era. The fundamental observations that he made about adaptation of species and natural selection and genetic diversity are fundamental and still form a bedrock of science today. Thoreau's writings have been very influential in terms of influence of the natural world. And one thing that I wanted to highlight in particular today is the birthday next year of Frederick Law Olmsted, who was kind of the founder of the field of landscape architecture and had a very deep appreciation for the natural world, ranging from urban parks all the way to wilderness and the benefits that these natural spaces had for people. So I kind of put Olmsted into my talk today to kind of center that value as we talk about forests and brain health. And this photo here is a beautiful photo that I see that you use to advertise my talk. So I swiped it to share that with you now. So a little bit more about Frederick Law Olmsted and the reason why I'm so interested in this is he was born in Hartford, and we have a number of Olmsted properties in Hartford, including Trinity College's campus was influenced by Olmsted. Bushnell Park was influenced by Olmsted. The Institute of Living, which is one of the first mental hospitals in the United States, which was founded on a priority for offering natural experiences to people who are having challenges, is also an Olmsted campus and an arboretum. So it's a very deep history in Connecticut that I think we should be proud to stand up for and honor. The other reason why I wanted to mention Olmsted is he had a number of backgrounds. He was a farmer, he was a journalist, he had a bunch of different types of education that he brought to bear in terms of his approach to the land. And I think we need to harken back to those values and bring a number of different disciplines into the conversation so that we can have a strategic plan that brings us to our best future. So one of the quotes I wanted to share from Frederick Law Olmsted is related to the Organic Act of 1916. I'm not sure if this quote is directly from him, but he had a big influence on the act that founded the national park system, and the goal of that was to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife and leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. So that's an obligation that we have to the future and to our best future, is to try and keep the natural world as intact as possible where possible. So just to give a little arc on this, some perspectives on nature and health, Indigenous people, particularly Native Americans, Eastern woodland spiritual practices often have spiritual groves or sacred spaces. In the 1800s, there was a focus on the nature cure in terms of gardens, hospitals, camping, parks. My colleague, who's a pediatric neurologist, and she's Swedish, she shared with me that if you want to tell someone kind of to like buzz off, only in a little bit meaner way, but I don't want to say something meaner, you would say dra at skogen, which means go to the forest. Like, I don't want to deal with you. You just go to the forest, with the intention that once you're back from the forest, then maybe you'll be better and I'll be willing to deal with you again. Ralph Waldo Emerson and John Muir talked about healing powers. Olmsted talked particularly about urban preventative health. And this was at a time when most of the urban health-related issues were around sanitation and disease. He talked about these natural places, and like Central Park, as being a place for clean air and a natural environment to promote health. And his writing also includes a lot about equity, education, and ecology, values that we need to, think about very seriously today. We know that forests are essential, both for, I'm going to share a little bit with you about, why they're essential for our minds today. Many of our medicines have come from the forest. They are the most biodiverse land-based ecosystem, and they're critical to addressing the climate and biodiversity crisis. And we really need a strategic plan to protect our lifelines by deciding what we're doing where and why. As part of the GC3 Science and Technology Working Group, we looked at this kind of co-benefits approach called multisolving. So multisolving is trying to identify strategies that are good for the planet long-term and also offer near-term additional benefits. It's a strategy that was kind of formally put forth by MIT and by a group called Climate Interactive. So in the GC3, we, of course, embraced all of the values of multisolving, which are food and water, jobs, health and well-being, climate protection, which is at the core of it. And we also explicitly included diverse perspectives in equity and ecological integrity. Since multisolving was sort of put forth, there have been a number of very staggering reports on biodiversity and ecological integrity that really are our lifelines to the future. And the other thing we put forth is that we really need to have unbiased interdisciplinary approaches We need to focus on what are the impacts and, how can we be preventative for our health and the health of the planet? What are the essentials we need to protect? What are the data and research that we need and are missing, and how can we collect it? Some of these are very complex long-term systems, and we need a very serious commitment to long-term research strategies. We need to be focusing on locally scaled solutions. Sometimes these general, vague messages may be inappropriate for a specific location. So we need really like boots on the ground to interpret the latest science. And I really hope we can have a positive approach to our health and how we can keep our communities in the best shape possible. My final point before I start going through some additional data is that science and everyday life cannot and should not be separated. We're all kind of scientists in one way or another, whether it's gardening or cooking or at your job or, figuring out how to, manage your kids or all of that kind of stuff. Our brains are essentially scientific machines that are taking in information, integrating that information into our current database, responding to different environmental cues, and then figuring out what to do in response to that information. So what I've found in the past few years is this linking forest and brain health is a rapidly advancing research topic with many variables, many different disciplines that are interested in it, and kind of moving forward on parallel paths in a number of countries around the world. For example, in the UK, the NHS forest, National Health Service forest, has a motto. It's a specific forest with a motto, growing forests for health. And the other take-home message that I want to share with you today is this is something that benefits everyone. It can benefit you if you have a specific problem like blood pressure issues or anxiety, recovery from stroke. But it also benefits healthy people of all ages. And it also benefits people even if they're unable to walk through the forest. It benefits you even if you're only able to have an assisted movement through the forest. In terms of a meta-analysis on forests and brain health, with all this work going on all over the world, I was trying to pull this together, and there's so many different variables and so many different populations, ages, gender, disorders. It's difficult for any one thing to pull together a real large body of evidence, but that's coming. And so far, there is several meta-analyses on forest bathing, which is also known as Shinrin-yoku, and was kind of really popularized in Japan about almost 30 years ago. So it's had enough time to sort of be a specific thing. There's been enough specific science around it. And the meta-analyses associated with forest bathing so far have shown reduced anxiety, reduced stress hormones, and reduced blood pressure. All of these things are kind of indicators for improved brain health. Increased blood pressure is associated with stroke and other cardiometabolic issues. Stress hormones, chronic stress is associated with immune issues, learning issues. Chronic stress can even be associated with brain shrinking in critical areas. And anxiety is something that many, many people are dealing with. And anxiety is something that can progress into chronic depression, which is even more difficult to treat. So if you can kind of be preventative, right, do an intervention where you're restoring brain health when it's gotten a little bit out of whack because of these kind of general changes, that's a real health benefit to you personally and to our healthcare system, where a lot of dollars are going to chronic disease. In case anyone wants to ask about gardening, I'm not going to talk more about gardening today, but I want to let you know that gardening is also beneficial for health. And there have been some work on depression and specific microbes in the soil that are beneficial for depression. Some of the things that I looked at when I was trying to, someone asked exactly what is forest bathing? So forest bathing is basically kind of a fancy term for being in the forest and doing kind of it's not there's no water, and there's no specific activity that you need to do except for just take in the forest through all of your senses. You can do some guided meditations. Sometimes people do that, but it's kind of a thoughtful, just meditative experience in the forest. So kind of relaxing. So that's what it is. So in terms of a lot of kind of keywords that I, as a neuroscientist, would look into if I wanted to say, all right, how could I improve brain health or brain resilience? What are some terms that I would look for? So I looked up a whole bunch of terms. This is just a sample of kind of the range of terms that I looked at to try to explore this topic. And basically what I found, is that there's a lot of quantified peer-reviewed research. There are some population studies and epidemiological work. There's a lot of work on short-term benefits. I'm particularly interested in any mechanistic evidence where these experiences could prevent or reverse disease, because that's kind of the holy grail in neuroscience. Most neurological problems are not well treated. They're masked by medication and not necessarily cured. And cures are more likely to be a way where you can kind of allow the natural resilience of that complex system to change its own structure or function or behavior. So that's, in neuroscience, these disease modifying opportunities are really considered kind of the holy grail, and they are most linked to lifestyle issues. So I'll start with the good news, and it's kind of all good news with the forest and health, is that walking is very beneficial. It's kind of underrated in terms of an opportunity for exercise. So you don't have to be a superstar athlete. You can just walk. And even without walking, as I said, even if you're in a wheelchair, moving through a natural environment improves creativity. And that was shown in a study where they had people either sitting or walking, and they were walked indoors or they were moved in a chair. And what they found is whether they were moved in a chair or if they walked on their own accord, either one of those experiences improved creativity when they were outdoors. So on the right side, there is sitting and walking outdoors, and then on the left side is sitting or walking indoors. So you can see that sitting in a wheelchair and moving outdoors is more beneficial than just sitting indoors. And the things that they quantified in terms of creativity were things like novel ideas, divergent thinking, increased number of high quality ideas. So creativity is something that you can measure quantitatively. There are a number of scales. And this is, kind of what I was talking about as well in terms of interdisciplinary science that we were looking at on the GC3, the Governor's Council on Climate Change. It wasn't about, someone asked in the chat, I just saw about green chemistry. It was the acronym for the Governor's Council on Climate Change. And I felt that it was really important to look at all kinds of disciplines: social science, natural science, physical science, and emerging data. In terms of depression, a big review came out in 2019 in the annual review of public health. What are sort of the proximal, sort of kind of within the brain mechanisms associated with depression? What are the near stimuli in your environment, like noise or pollen or air pollution? What are the other kind of aspects in your environment, your work, your family, your friends? And what are these really kind of distant contexts that may be influencing depression? So some of the things that I think are really emerging as factors in depression are anxiety about the climate, anxiety about the future. Recently, obviously, anxiety about the pandemic. Some of the buffers that we have on that are these natural systems, biodiversity, ecosystems, and natural environments. There's something that help to provide a prevention against that anxiety. So when we looked at what are a list of these things and what are their evidence for strong evidence for positive or negative effects, one of the things that there's very strong evidence, and this is a global issue, global health issue, there's very strong evidence that air pollution is linked to depression. And you may have noticed from the work in the past year that areas with a high level of air pollution were also had very much higher rates of and poor outcomes in response to COVID. Urban living is also associated with higher levels of depression. And it's actually not just depression, it's also more serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia. So having access to these natural environments, which is associated with a lower level of depression, can help to mitigate those factors which increase the risk for depression. In terms of mechanistically, what might be going on in the brain, there was a really nice study that natural experiences can reduce rumination in the brain in people and reduce activity in an area of the brain that's associated with rumination, so the prefrontal cortex. And this was a really unbelievable match where they gave people a survey and they found that after they had a 90-minute walk in nature versus an urban setting, when people walked in nature, there was a significant decrease in rumination. There was no difference when they were walking in the urban setting. When they scanned their brains, they found that in that area of the prefrontal cortex, there was a decreased activity in that area, which matched the same results that they got on self-report. So in the urban environment, there was no change in the prefrontal cortex activity. There was a significant decrease after the experience in nature. So when I was talking about how anxiety can lead to chronic depression, this kind of rumination is something that can be associated with anxiety. So if you're able to intervene and interrupt that kind of rumination that's kind of progressing to a more persistent state, that could have some real benefits. With my students, I've recently been looking at trying to measure heart rate variability, which is a measure of the interbeat interval between your heart rate. So your heart rate may be, 50 beats a minute. Let's say you have a really good heart rate. But the exact timing between each beat is slightly different. So the way that changes over time is related to your heart rate variability, is quantified as your heart rate variability. And a higher coherence means that you have kind of slow changes in that variability over time. And that's associated with better kind of response to stress and resilience and other kinds of factors. So this is something that I've just working on submitting a research protocol for. And this is just some preliminary data that we collected last fall when we were kind of limited in what we could do. And we took a field trip in Hartford. We were walking in the urban environment, and then we went into the forest in Hartford. And this is one student's record, and I have records from a bunch of students, and on average, this shows out too, but this one student had the best kind of model trace to show you, is that when we transitioned from the urban environment into the forest, her coherence increased dramatically, and then it dropped again when we came out of the forest. So this was a very interesting finding that we want to kind of follow up on and develop some research protocols around this. And heart rate variability is sort of a new measure that people have started looking at. In terms of populations that may have specific challenges, there have been a number of studies showing that wild nature helps veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder and can also help at-risk teens. Some of this work has been done by the Sierra Club, and there are folks in Connecticut who are official Sierra Club guides for this kind of work. And this is associated with what's an increasingly appreciated quality of the healing power of awe. And I think this is something that harkens back to the kind of historical figures that I talked about before. They understood the awe that people feel in these natural environments. And what we know now by doing kind of quantified measures is that experiencing awe, which is something you may have as a religious experience or with an incredible piece of artwork or music, or in nature. And nature sometimes is more accessible to people than some of these other experiences. And you just need to be there. Awe is associated with increased altruism, cooperation, empathy, and compassion. And feelings of fairness and compassion are the two qualities that are associated with being willing to take action to address climate change. So all of these things are kind of related, where we need to start making strategic decisions. We need to be approaching our communities and the natural world from a position of empathy and altruism in order to figure out how to have our best future. Now, when the Walter Reed Hospital moved to Bethesda, they purposefully put in a natural area for wounded soldiers and their families to experience, called the Green Road Project. So this was a purposeful installation of a natural healing environment, and it was headed up by Dr. Frederick Foote, a retired Navy neurologist. And the three things that they tried to look at in particular, and I need to follow up and see where this work is at, are biomarkers of stress, a natural language analysis, so they could see what these soldiers were expressing and feeling, and also changes in gene expression. So it's a combination of kind of self-report and quantified physiological markers. A biomarker of stress is something that could change acutely up and down. Changes in gene expression are the kinds of things that can promote the long-term disease modification that I was talking about. So changes in the proteins and receptors and structural elements of the brain, changes in those little fuzzy things. What's happening when we learn is you're either losing or gaining those little dendritic spines that I showed you on that neuron in the beginning. So that's, this is really important work, and it needs to be done in more than one location. There is work out of Germany in Berlin, where they found that there were structural differences in the brain in people that lived closer to a forest environment. So they called the forest environment an enriched environment. And what they did is they looked at the landscape and coded it all. And the structural changes they found were in the amygdala, which is an area associated with kind of emotional processing and is connected with the cortex and areas, the prefrontal cortex. So kind of critical area of the brain. And structural changes can be the kind of thing for disease prevention, disease modification, disease reversal. And when they coded the landscape in Berlin, they coded it as forests, so green urban spaces like parks, a little bit of gray area is land like of unknown use, kind of urban areas and water. So you can see there's a lot of urban areas, some parks, and then some forests kind of around the edge. And they found that living within 1 kilometer of a forest was associated with better integrity of the amygdala. So just to kind of sum up where I think things are at with forests and brain health, is I think it really does align with the components of evidence-based medicine. So evidence-based medicine considers patient values and preferences, considers clinical expertise, and considers the best available evidence to try and make decisions. And from all the evidence that's been accumulating, it seems that forests do no harm. People don't have more depression after they spend time in forests. It doesn't exacerbate chronic conditions. Protecting forests and spending time in forests aligns very strongly with public values. And they're a very low cost opportunity with a very high potential for quality and efficacy to address some of the chronic and accelerating public health conditions we have right now. I want to highlight a place that I really love, which is just over the border in Monterey, Massachusetts, called Gould Farm. Gould Farm was founded in 1913 by William Gould. It's a treatment facility, residential treatment facility for people with bipolar disorder and depression. It's a working farm. They grow most of their food, and all the guests that are there with mental illness challenges work on the farm, um, either in the fields, in the forests, in the, have a little cafe. Um, and they take this healing environment very seriously, that they have some areas that are dedicated sort of as spiritual areas for natural healing. And when a forester made the plan for Gould Farm the past couple of times, they've basically identified, okay, here's your woodlot where you're getting some wood. Here's your agricultural area. And the area that I've highlighted right here, which is a small subset of the 600 acres, is an area with core habitats and rare species that was recommended for essentially a forever wild type of easement, because it has these properties. It has a vernal pool, it has some rare species there, and they are really interested in keeping this as a natural area for that benefit, spiritual benefits for people, for the ecological value of it, for the connection to place across generations. Because once you've been at Gould Farm, you're welcome to come back forever. And it's really a place that is intended to be there for people. And this intergenerational connection and knowing that something will be there for you is something that people really need, and is a big buffer against the anxiety that people are feeling with the climate crisis and other types of disruption. So with that goal in mind, I was very proud to help to have Belden Forest in Simsbury inducted into the Old Growth Forest Network. I'm the county coordinator for Hartford County. It's only 40 acres, but it's right in the center of Simsbury. So it's accessible to everyone. It's on the bus line. It's next to the library. It's next to the Veterans Memorial. And it's just a special place that everyone now knows will be there for them. I'd like to give a shout out to Joan Malouf. She's an ecologist, and she's the executive director and founder of the Old Growth Forest Network. She recently published a very nice synthesis on vitamin F for forests being critical for human and planetary health. So check that out. And I'd also like to just highlight a little research study that was just done about the pandemic and being nature deprived if you felt cooped up, or some places were overcrowded and closed down. And what this survey found when they looked at flourishing is that feeling strongly nature deprived was worse than losing wages. And the only thing that was worse than being strongly nature deprived was losing your job entirely. And this is based on a study, a 90-point scale of flourishing. It was done by Linda Tomaso with colleagues at the T.H. Chan School of Public Health at Harvard. When I received this from Linda, it was under review, the relationship between nature exposure and well-being under the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's now been published, so you could find that. If you want to know how much nature do you need, a big study was done in the UK with 20,000 participants, and found that 120 minutes is associated with good health and well-being. It doesn't have to be all at one time. So you can kind of accumulate bits here and there, but that kind of can give you a target for spending time in nature. And I just like to wrap up with a couple of points to just say that this is really the kind of co-benefits that we really need to be strategic about: clean air, clean water, climate mitigation, protecting our natural heritage, helping people all across the landscape to have access to this, understanding that with forests, even a relatively small area can provide quiet, a sense of awe. You wouldn't believe how cool and quiet it is in Belden Forest, even though it's only 40 acres compared to just outside on the street in Simsbury. It's quite magical, actually. I didn't have time today to talk more about mechanisms in medicines, but I do think that, making sure that we maintain the library of evolution for new medicines and for things we haven't discovered yet is just so critically important. I can't emphasize that enough. I also want to give a little shout out to Northwest Connecticut because you're in a very special place. You're part of the global safety net, which is an international consensus of areas that are needed for the combined values of climate, protecting the climate and protecting biodiversity. It was part of kind of a study that crossed the border in Massachusetts of the Upper Housatonic Valley area because of the combined cultural and historical and natural values, which are the things that we associate, with our national park system. So this is really a very special area. And the other thing that's special about this area is there are some fragments of old growth forest in this area. There were about 300 acres of kind of known remnants of old growth forests. And there's actually a student in Connecticut who has been trying to find any other remnants by looking at old photographs and going out to these places, and has found a number of additional remnants. Surprisingly, none of these critical remnants, which is kind of like our seed corn, except for there's no other food besides corn. I mean, like really critical stuff. They don't have any special protection. And so I'm just very concerned that we make a strategic plan for our landscape so we don't accidentally run over these vital areas that we need to keep natural systems intact and connected and to protect our water. Clean water is an essential. So to kind of wrap up now, I mean, I just want to emphasize that evidence-based solutions for anything, the first thing you want to do is prevent harm to people or to the planet. We need more science, we need baselines, we need control groups, we need research protocols. There is so much we don't know. For natural systems, I think it's really important to increase interdisciplinary approaches, prevention, outreach, really think about the role which is used in medicine now more and more in terms of watchful waiting or active surveillance. And consider the, international messaging, which is getting louder and louder, that the three things we need to do are protect, restore, and connect. There's a recent comprehensive report called the Nexus Report and a very good international consensus report that's very readable called the 10 Golden Rules. The reason why I think Connecticut is really so important, we have the largest state level land trust conference in the country. We're part of the global safety net, particularly Northwest Connecticut is. Back to Olmsted and his values, Bushnell Park was approved via referendum, and I believe it was the first public park that was paid for and voted by voters. We have the Institute of Living, which is an incredibly valuable historic asset. Of course, we have Trinity College, which was called the Green Lung of Hartford, and we're approaching our bicentennial in 2023. He really understood kind of the both relaxing and the dual relaxing and invigorating role that nature played for our minds and for our bodies. And this was a value that he brought when he designed parks and when he talked about the importance of protecting wild areas. My students have been looking at the campus last semester and this semester, and we've been trying to get outside a little bit, not be cooped up in the classroom. They really have been not allowed to leave campus. And we've been looking just at the trees on campus with an eye toward making the campus a model of urban ecology and an arboretum. We have 96 species of trees on Trinity's campus, which is phenomenal. And my students finally said to me, why are we celebrating so many things at the college and ignoring these incredible trees? Well, I don't know. That is a good question. And in fact, this one incredible tree on the right side of my screen is right on our quad. It's been here, it's been there since the campus has been there. And it's right on the quad where the students graduate. It has stood there for every graduating class, and it's the #1 English elm in Connecticut. So I feel like this is kind of like an old gnarled icon of, genetic diversity. Why did all the other elms die and this elm is still alive? It's really a survivor. So the last thing, I'm not going to go through this. I just want to thank the organizations that have funded my work and my community organizations that I love and I'm very devoted to. I want to leave time for questions. So I'd like to really thank you all for your attention. And I'm sorry I didn't do a good job at monitoring the chat, but I will try and check it out now.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very, very much. That was really wonderful. I'm going to do this. So would you like to just go right from the chat, or do you want me to read the questions to you?
Sure. I think I'll probably be able to get through more questions if I just zip through them. So,
and I just want to, we did get that one question via email that I'd like to read, and maybe we can start off with that one.
Sure.
Okay, so this is from a man who lives in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. And he says that access to wild spaces can be limited and intimidating for people of color in my county. So for a myriad of reasons, not least prejudices of and a lack of diversity within nonprofit land steward organizations. So what role can urban forests, urban rewilding, and urban habitat restoration play in promoting the benefits of forest bathing for underprivileged communities?
Great, thank you for that question. I'm actually from Pittsfield, Massachusetts, so Pittsfield is near and dear to my heart. So I think that one of the goals of my work at Harvard was, this forest and brain health work. The other goal was trying to identify these wild areas that would be accessible to everyone. Many people don't have time or money to go on vacation to some area, or may not feel comfortable. And this was one of the goals of actually making the first old growth forest in Connecticut be one that was so accessible, right in the middle of town, to show that, to be able to have an opportunity to bring people to some place that was so accessible. There's an older forest in Hartford that, I think would be ideal to bring people to. And I would recommend trying to reach out to any hiking groups. I know there's a Western Mass kind of hiking group. And I know a lot of people in Pittsfield. I would be happy to hook you up with them. In fact, I know this one very active group called the Monday Mountain Boys. And I know they would welcome you if you wanted to come with them on a Monday. So that's what I would suggest, is trying to just find some opportunities to do it with other people so you can become comfortable and find accessible opportunities that might be near where you live.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm back to the chat. Someone asked me privately what projects with Harvard Medical School, but I'm happy to answer that for everyone. So I was particularly partnered with Steve Schachter, who's in neurology, and his main work is on forest botanicals, particularly forest botanicals for epilepsy and pain, which are two topics that I study in my biomedical research lab. So that's what I was kind of working on there with Steve, but I was really focused on trying to pull together this information on forest and brain health, and also identify areas that people could count on as these little wild areas or larger wild areas in, they're accessible to people in Southern New England, which is very densely populated. And we don't have any national parks. And so I think that's something we really need to think of, is designating areas that are going to be part of this strategic intact network of nature to protect our ecology and protect our clean water, et cetera. Let's see.
So I think there was somebody who wanted a definition of rumination.
Oh yes, rumination. So rumination means kind of like perseverative negative self-talk. So it could be rumination about a specific thing, or it could be, rumination like, you know, I'm a terrible person. I'm never going to be successful. I didn't do that right. So just kind of a negative voice inside your head, which we all have sometimes. But if that becomes dominant, you can see that it just starts to define your inner dialogue.
And I think that this is a question I had too, which is it just forest, or can you get the same benefit from a walk just outside, you know, maybe around a field or going sailing or just being outdoors in general? Or is there something about the trees?
I think there is something about the coordination of the visual kind of diversity, the different smells. There's a whole area on the volatile chemicals in the forest. I think it's a combined values, but it's definitely beneficial to be outside at all in type of environment. Could there be more oxygen in the forest rather than the urban area affecting the heart rate and variability? So yes, that is an important aspect to take into account and try and control for. But that could be one of the reasons why it's having those benefits. So there are ways to do that in a controlled manner, and that is important to take that into account. Great question. Let's see, scrolling down here. Oh, another oxygen question. How do desert and other kinds of environmental areas, how do they maintain their mental health? Well, there's also a benefit, and Olmsted recognize this in terms of seeing a vista. So there's, you know, if you grow, it's also kind of the sense of place. I didn't get into kind of the power of place. So a place that you grow up in also has a very powerful role in your mental health and well-being. So obviously in New England, and a forest is the predominant natural ecosystem throughout New England. So it's something that if you grew up around here, you're have an affinity towards. If you grew up in a desert, maybe that becomes your favorite landscape. It doesn't mean that a desert is not beneficial for me or a forest is not beneficial for someone who grew up in a desert. Let's see.
We've got a question about old growth. How old is old growth?
So old growth, so there's two terms that kind of get sometimes confused. One is primary forest. So that's a forest that's an original forest. It's never been cut. It's kind of in its original evolved state. That is the absolutely most critical thing we need to protect wherever we find that, because that is our absolute library of evolution. However, forests that maybe previously were cut, like in New England, but have been growing back at about 125 years or so, 150, they are transitioning to exhibit characteristics of old growth. So that means, you know, little evidence of disturbance, a lot of down woody debris, a diversity of tree sizes, including some very large trees. And in general, the definition is about when the forest has achieved about half the age of the kind of dominant sort of tree species in the forest. So trees in New England live for several hundred years. So that would be a definition of old growth around here. Is there any help for the deforestation of the Amazon? That's a different question. And I think the first thing they should stop doing is cutting it down. So that would help a lot with that. Let's see. Oh yeah, someone suggested visiting Great Mountain Forest. I absolutely agree. Everyone should visit Great Mountain Forest. It's, I think, about 6,000 acres between that and McLean Game Refuge. They're really kind of the biggest, really big forest blocks in Connecticut. Very critical on the landscape to have these big blocks that can, you know, have all of these different biological processes happening.
And just, I heard that they believe there's a breeding population of moose up in Great Mountain Forest right now. So you probably don't want to run into one, but I think that's very exciting.
Very exciting, very exciting. Do any of the organizations you mentioned help fight incursions into our local forests by developers? Short answer, I guess, would be no. But I am associated with Keep the Woods, which did help to preserve the Ethel Walker Woods in Simsbury, which was a forest that we helped with a kind of collaborative project that included the Trust for Public Land, the Farmington River Watershed Association, Trout Unlimited. So a bunch of groups kind of pulled together. So I would recommend just trying to reach out to environmental groups. If you want to email me, I could, maybe give some ideas. If it's a particularly valuable forest, maybe a local land trust or the Trust for Public Land might be interested in it. They recently have been helping to protect 288 acres in my town, which is a combination of farmland, some habitat connections, grassland habitat, and the historic barns, which is the farmland where Martin Luther King worked when he was in Simsbury. So that's been quite a project. You can probably read about that in the news in Simsbury.
Yeah, we've got maybe the last two questions about proving your work and measuring results. And I think you may have already touched on the primary forest in this area, but.
Yeah. So how do I prove my work or measure my results? So I haven't, I'm still waiting for approval of my study. So my strategy with all of my work, which is primarily biomedical work, is I kind of look at the same problem from multiple directions. So let's say I use rats and mice in my biomedical work. So let's say I'm trying to look at locomotor activity in my animals. I might measure locomotor activity in several different tests. And those tests may also measure learning, or also may measure grooming, or might also measure social behavior. So I always try and measure things from several approaches. So then I know that I'm not getting a something that has a confound that would result in a misinterpretation of that data. So for this work with the forest and brain health, I'm going to need control groups. I'm going to need different types of environments. I'm going to need to replicate it. So science takes a long time, actually. So, and then it all goes through peer review. So that's the other thing. Once you've done all your work, it goes through peer review from other scientists, and then they write back. And you have to have a thick skin, because they may say, well, you missed this, you have to go back and do this additional work before I'll agree to have it published. And this process can take, quite a long time.
And the primary forest in this area, what would you?
Primary forest in this area, I think there are some very small fragments. And so Sage's Ravine, I think, is one area. Often, if it was an area where there was too steep, or a gorge or something like that, it may not have huge trees, but it may be trees that have never been cut, and it's just been kind of evolving in a natural state for a long time. And the way that Jack, oh yeah, and I forgot, there's also Cathedral Pines, which did have a blowdown a number of years ago, but it's recovering now. And there's another area of Ballyhack in Cornwall. So there are a couple of little fragments. And the way that Jack did his work is he looked at aerial photos, old aerial photos. And what he kind of surmised is, since the landscape was essentially cleared by European settlers, and we've been so fortunate that the forests have grown back, a lot of areas in forests were cleared and they didn't grow back. And, we don't know how many times we can do that. So we need to be kind of careful with, as I said, maintaining strategically, where are we going to prioritize for natural processes? So what Jack did is looked at these aerial photos, found areas where there were trees, and then went out there, surmising that if there were trees then, and there are trees still now, perhaps those might be old growth areas. And he's still working on it. So it's kind of a phenomenal work that he just took upon himself.
Well, that just sounds incredible. But so I think I think we're going to wrap this up, and I can't thank you enough. That was really, really interesting and inspirational. And I think you're going to have everybody here. I'm just trying to, well, I'm just going to let that person go. But anyhow, thank you so much. And we're heading into that season where we can be outside more easily than during the winter. And just before everybody leaves, I do want to give a shout out for our program next Saturday, again with the Salisbury Association Land Trust. And this is going to be on grizzly bears. And clearly that's out west. They're not here, but there are two tacks on this, sort of their natural history and also advocacy for protecting the species. And there are details on our website, scovillelibrary.org. So thank you very, very much. This will be recorded and on our YouTube channel, probably by the end of the week, if you have friends who you would like to inspire to get outside and improve their mental health. So thank you very much, Susan.
Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you to the sponsoring organizations, which I think were Aton Forest and Salisbury Land Trust as well as the Scoville Library. You guys have a great, great organizations in the Northwest Connecticut. I love that area. Unfortunately, I work in Hartford, but I love Northwest Connecticut. And thank you so much for your interest.
Great. Well, thanks again. And I'm going to end the meeting, but thank you everybody for coming, and I hope to see you next time. Take care. Bye.